Like the practice of compassion, forgiveness does not ignore the truth of our suffering. Forgiveness is not weak. It demands courage and integrity. Yet only forgiveness and love can bring about the peace we long for. As the Indian sage Meher Baba explained, true love is not for the faint-hearted. We have all betrayed and hurt others, just as we have knowingly or unknowingly been harmed by them. It is inevitable in the human realm. Sometimes our betrayals are small, sometimes terrible. Extending and receiving forgiveness is essential for redemption from our past. To forgive does not mean that we condone the misdeeds of the other. We can dedicate ourselves to make sure they never happen again. But without forgiveness, the world can never be released from the sorrows of the past. As someone quipped, forgiveness means giving up all hope for a better past. Forgiveness is a way to move on. That's the end of the reading. So I think I must start with a confession and maybe a plea for some forgiveness. I've come here to speak about forgiveness, and yet I rarely ever forgive anyone. So maybe I need some forgiveness from you on that, maybe? No? I really do try to practice what I preach. So I'm not here to preach that you should go out and forgive people. That's not what I'm here to do today. At least not in the traditional idea of forgiveness. And, from the sanctuary that you extend here, that is a type of forgiveness, a non-traditional kind of forgiveness that it seems that you are already giving. So I'm here to try to say a little bit more about that sort of non-traditional way. And as I was researching for this sermon, you go online and you Google it, and all these memes and all these pithy sayings came up about forgiveness, the traditional form of forgiveness. Are you interested in hearing any of those? No? No? I bothered to write it down. One of them said, "My problem is that I can't stay mad. I always end up forgiving people even when they don't deserve it." Always forgive your enemies. Nothing annoys them so much. I cleaned this up a little bit. Just because I forgave you doesn't mean that you're no longer a jerk. And one I debated whether to talk about this. Sometimes the first step to forgiveness is understanding that the other person is a complete idiot. The first step. As in with all these types of things, there's a little bit of truth there. There's a little bit of... But the first step, I don't know if we did it in steps. One of the funniest things I found online was a blog entry by Dr. Wayne Dyer, who's usually pretty insightful if you sort of get into his mindset. And I don't think he was trying to be funny. The title of the blog post was, "How to Forgive Someone Who Has Hurt You in 15 Steps." I mean, Alcoholics Anonymous only has 12 steps, okay? 15 steps. That seems a bit much. And now, to be fair, his 15 steps were all good things to do in your life anyway, but it seemed an overly complicated way to achieve or to get at forgiveness. And Dr. Dyer and many of the people who teach forgiveness, I think they sometimes forget the point of what forgiveness is and is not. So I collected a few things that I think forgiveness is not. It is not easy. Forgiveness is not easy. It is not permission to continue harmful behavior. It is not condoning the behavior. It is not forgetting or acting as though it never happened. And in my view, forgiveness is not what God gives to sinners. If forgiveness is something that God doles out, it's something that God could decide to not dole out. I see, as we are universalists, that the forgiveness came pre-built in. So whatever concept of a deity or the sacred or the holy that you see there, the forgiveness comes with it, if you're open to it. Forgiveness is not always reconciliation. And I'm going to talk about what Martin Luther King talks about, how essential forgiveness is, reconciliation. But it does not really, I mean, you can forgive and stay away. That's okay. And forgiveness is not always done at once. It's not just this thing that you flip a switch and it's done. Sometimes it comes in stages, and sometimes it has to be done many times. And it is not necessarily a gift that you give to someone else or that they can ask for and then you bequeath it. Now, a conservative Christian view takes a little bit of a different take on this, and these come from a conservative view that's not very, very far out of the mainstream, but it's worth looking at how many other people look at forgiveness. Because if you get into a conflict with someone who has a more conservative religious view, theological view than you do, it may help to understand how they see forgiveness. And this particular list refers to it as biblical forgiveness. And they, right off the bat, say that biblical forgiveness is a gift to the offender. Something that you do for them. They also say that God redeems and heals the past rather than erases it. It's not a thing of you letting go. It's God will redeem this. Biblical forgiveness is required. That's just one view. Not all Christians hold this view. Biblical forgiveness humbles the forgiver. Now, admittedly, some humility goes a long way, but I don't think that you are supposed to be humbled by the forgiveness. Biblical forgiveness frees you to love the offender. I'm going to argue that it's the other way around. You forgive them because you love them. And biblical forgiveness, I actually said this, biblical forgiveness is concerned with the well-being of all people, particularly the guilty and the needy. I hope we have a different view. Not that there's something terribly wrong with this, but I can see how that view makes forgiveness into this angst-ridden obligation that you do to make yourself better or to make yourself more favorable in the eyes of God. My heart goes out to people who have that view of forgiveness. So I want to try to lay out here something that hopefully is going to be more uplifting to your spirit. But the question does come when it comes into forgiveness, is forgiveness really needed in some situations? All these times we think, we should forgive them for X, Y, or Z. We're angry at them for X, Y, or Z. I think the first question is why are we angry? What's going on here? What's going on here? How did we get to this situation? So a family that I was involved with, where the matriarch of the family had died, and she had left behind, and her husband had died several years earlier, and she left behind several grown children and their spouses. The matriarch had put small stickers. She had gone around before her death and put stickers on things with the names of who she wanted to receive that after her death. these were not items of high, dollar value. They were sentimental. They were things that she had collected on her travels. They were things that she had used for years and years and years in the house. And some of the items had connections to some of her children, and she wanted them to have them. A very sentimental family. Now, each of the children was struggling in their own way. Everybody grieves their own way. There was this struggle and emotions going on. And in the midst of all of this, a daughter-in-law was caught swapping stickers. So already in this raw emotional state, this indignation, denial, embarrassment, anger, hurt, all rolled up there. And 20 years later, rifts still remain in the family. Forgiveness has not been given. Now let's bring it a little closer to home. Because we all have times when we have feelings of resentment or disdain against other people. Things annoy you. There's people that you just disagree with very much, very fundamentally. And there's people, say people who may have voted for a different presidential candidate, for example. Can you forgive them? Do you need to forgive them? Just asking. Has any grievous harm been done? Maybe. Maybe not. Certainly there are cases where wrong has been done. Real harm has occurred. And real forgiveness can be difficult. I'm not trying to minimize this. But what about those times when you're just annoyed and nothing was really done? What about times when people just failed to meet your expectations? Is that a case where you have to give forgiveness? What about when people just fail to be perfect as you expected them to be? Former Catholic priest and by the name of Henry Nouwen, a theologian and a man who spent his last decade in a Warsh community. So I very much find him to be a person that I resonate with. He pointed out, but what is there to forgive or to ask forgiveness for? As people who have hearts that long for perfect love, we have to forgive one another for not being able to give or receive that perfect love in our everyday lives. Our many needs constantly interfere with our desire to be there for the other unconditionally. Our love is always limited by spoken or unspoken conditions. What needs to be forgiven? And he writes, we need to forgive one another for not being God. Or I would just say, we need to forgive each other for not being perfect. What about the person that cuts you off in traffic? Or the careless comment on social media? Or the long wait for services at the DMV or at some business? What about the actions of a person who did something wrong to you, but they did it because of just carelessness, or they did it because of they're addicted to alcohol or drugs? What is the process of forgiveness there? What about in the story for all ages, the monk? How did the two monks relate to this woman who was, surly and mean? Was forgiveness needed there? Henry Nouwen also goes on to explain about why we may hold on to things the way that the younger monk did. He says, to forgive another person from the heart is an act of liberation. We set that person free from the negative bonds that exist between us. We say, I no longer hold your offenses against you. But there is more. We also free ourselves from the burden of being the offended one. As long as we do not forgive those who have wounded us, we carry them with us, or worse, pull them as a heavy load. And he finishes up with, the great temptation is to cling in anger to our enemies and then define ourselves as being offended or wounded by them. What happens to your self-image of a victim when you forgive? What happens to your image of the offender when you forgive? There are times when real harm is done. Sometimes you really are a victim. It happens. For example, Heather Heyer, the woman who was killed in Charlottesville. She really is a victim. Her family really is a victim. Her father, Mark Heyer, lives in a little town of Sharps, Florida. And forgive me if I sort of slip into this little southern vernacular when I read his words. I'm not trying to mock him. I'm trying to capture his essence. People need to stop hating, and they need to forgive each other. And I include myself in that, in forgiving the guy who did this, okay? He doesn't know no better. You know, I just think of what the Lord said on the cross. Lord, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing, you know? He doesn't know no better. But Mark Heyer was trying to dig deep and find that forgiveness. Martin Luther King Jr. certainly epitomized forgiveness over and over. He wrote, and this is a long quote, but he says it much better than I ever could. Forgiveness does not mean ignoring what has been done or putting a false label on an evil act. It means rather that the evil act no longer remains as a barrier to the relationship. Forgiveness is a catalyst for creating an atmosphere necessary for a fresh start and a new beginning. It is the lifting of a burden or the canceling of a debt. The words, I forgive you but will never forget what you've done, never explain the real nature of forgiveness. Certainly one can never forget, if that means erasing it totally from the mind. But when we forgive, we forget in the sense that the evil deed is no longer a mental block impeding a new relationship. Likewise, we can never say, I will forgive you, but I won't have anything further to do with you. Forgiveness means reconciliation, a coming together again. End of quote. So on a larger societal level, he's correct. It does mean reconciliation. It does mean that we have to get along as a society. On an individual level, I'm not saying that you have to hang out with someone who is exhibiting harmful behavior to you. That's not what forgiveness means in an individual sense, but in a larger societal sense, where Martin Luther King was speaking, forgiveness is this reconciliation. He sees it as a coming together again, a larger community. And so he said it's not saying what they did is okay. It's not saying that you get away with it. It's saying that even though you did that thing, I'm still going to love you, and I'm still going to respect your inherent worth and dignity. To go back to another quote from Martin Luther King Jr. We must develop and maintain the capacity to forgive. He who is devoid of the power to forgive is devoid of the power to love. There is some good in the there's some good in the worst of us and some evil in the best of us. And when we discover that, we are less prone to hate our enemies. End of quote. So he's referring to our enemies. Nelson Mandela knew the danger of hating your enemies. He said, "As I walked out the door toward the gate that would lead to my freedom, I knew if I didn't leave my bitterness and hatred behind, I'd still be in prison." He led forgiveness and reconciliation on a grand scale. So forgiveness is necessary for communities. And I go back to Henry Nouwen. Community is not possible without the willingness to forgive one another 77 times. So a biblical reference. Forgiveness is the cement of our community life. Forgiveness holds us together through good and bad times, and it allows us to grow in mutual love. Okay, so it's important. How do we do it? How do we do it? A mentor of mine teaches courses on forgiveness and unconditional love. And he was teaching to a large room of United Methodist ministers. And he asked all of them, "How many of you preach on forgiveness?" And just about every hand in the room goes up. It's on the lectionary. They just about have to preach on it. And so then he asked a follow-up question. "How many of you preach on how to forgive?" Not so many hands. They preach about the need for forgiveness, but not how to do it. So how do we do this? Frank Ostaseski, who is the founder of the Zen Hospice, gives us a little clue when he says, letting go is not about releasing something or giving up something. It is about adopting a new perspective, seeing things in a new way. This is the spiritual practice. Part of that new perspective is to see why we are angry or why we're holding a grudge in the first place. To discern if even if you were harmed, or was it just you felt as though you were harmed. And we don't have to get into picking on the difference between those two, but you have to be curious about that and look into it and say, why am I angry? When Thich Nhat Hanh helped to rewrite the 5 Buddhist precepts, that is the basic intentions spoken by people who are becoming Buddhists, he renamed them into the 5 mindfulness trainings. He put in there, as part of the precepts that you agree to as a Buddhist, is to recognize that the roots of your anger, roots of my anger, are found in my wrong perceptions and lack of understanding of the suffering of others. The roots of the anger are in the not understanding. So it's either to understand why you were harmed or why you think you were harmed. Why did they do what they did? Do you understand it? Thich Nhat Hanh, again, says, the will to forgive is not enough. Even if you want to forgive, you cannot forgive. Only true understanding can bring about forgiveness. And this kind of understanding is only possible when you see the suffering of others. Just by your way of looking at things and doing things, you influence others. Approach everyone with love and patience and try to water the positive seeds in them. We have to help each other, being skillful, kind, and understanding. Blaming and arguing never help. And he continues, in the practice of mindfulness, we nurture the ability to see deeply into the nature of things and people, and the fruit is insight, understanding, and love. So we begin again with love. The song says we begin again in love. I say we begin again with love. It is having that love that opens you up to even looking to try to understand it. We forgive ourselves and each other. We begin again in love with love. Understanding is the fruit of this agapic love that we extend. So perhaps forgiveness is not what we really need to consider. Now, my spiritual practice is to try to understand, and to try to understand with love. And maybe someday something will happen to me that I just can't understand. I know as a kid, I didn't understand my parents. Somehow you find forgiveness there. But today, maybe someday I won't be able to understand, and maybe I will have to dig down and find some forgiveness. But I'm at least going to try to understand it first. This is the spiritual practice. Love is the balm of Gilead. And as Reinhold Niebuhr told us, forgiveness is the final form of love. Amen. Blessed be.